Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, but I'm afraid I have to start with an apology, which is never usually a good start, because some of you might have been expecting my colleague Beth Rigby to speak to you today, and I'm sorry she can't be here with us. And then for those who signed up a little later, you might have been expecting my colleague Sophie Ridge, but I'm afraid she has COVID-19. Don't worry, she's completely fine, and I am delighted to be here in her place. So apologies out of the way. I should probably introduce who I am instead of who I'm not. I'm Kate McCann. I'm part of the political team here at Sky News. And before I joined TV about 2 years ago, I worked in newspapers, including The Telegraph, The Sun, and The Guardian. So I was thinking about what to talk to you about today, and I had a look at what the brilliant Steve Richards said to you about a year ago on a pretty different stage. Now, he had some predictions, which is usually an unwise move for a political journalist, and I'm not going to give him a score out of 10 for them. But what struck me was just how much the political landscape has changed. It was a bit like seeing what you could have won, all the things we could have been talking about here today. Although maybe it's just political journalists who think that the aftermath of a Labour leadership election is some kind of prize. But without the virus, where would we be now? Would Boris Johnson be in so much pressure from his own MPs? Maybe not. Would Sir Keir Starmer be under even more pressure to have made a dent in the polls? Probably. And would Dominic Cummings have ended up walking out of government? That one I could see happening either way. But it's not just our personal lives that have been turned on their heads because of the pandemic. The machinery of government has been put under real strain too, as has political journalism. And questions are being asked about the way that we do things, whether they're right and what needs to change. Now, you can see that as a negative, or it could be an opportunity, and how we see it can shape our lives for years to come. So today I thought I'd talk to you briefly about some of those questions and some of the changes that COVID might bring too. And please, as we go along, do submit your questions and we'll try and go through as many as possible at the end. So I want to start by saying that this isn't about blame. No one could say that mistakes haven't been made in the way that COVID-19 has been handled in this country. You only need to look at the death toll so far to really see that. But I don't think it was willful either. Often, especially in the beginning of this pandemic, ministers faced choices that none of us would have been prepared for, and every decision has a price, clearly. But I do think it's fair to say that the way government speaks to us all has been a consistent theme and not necessarily a positive one. So my first question is, could they have communicated better? And it's funny, actually, because as I was watching Steve's speech, I got a call from my best friend. I was her birth partner, and I was on standby for the birth of her little girl. So I paused Steve, headed straight to the hospital, and as she was in the very final throes of labour, panicking, in pain, really afraid, she kept asking the midwife what to do. Now, anyone who's had a baby or been at the birth of a baby knows that this is pretty much the final moment. It's when you know the baby really is coming. But she only calmed down when she was given really clear instructions. And it struck me afterwards just how important it is when people are scared to give them the right information at the right time in a way that they can understand. And having worked closely with politicians and advisors through this pandemic, I'd say that's one of the areas where the government has been a bit lost. Now, part of this is about understanding the science, something I don't think that many of us did very well before the pandemic. Listening to the experts sounds like a logical thing to do, and it is. But you have to take a look at the latest reports on what happens when you space vaccine doses out, for example, to understand that science isn't just one big blob. They don't all agree. Now think about it, you're the Prime Minister, there's a shortage of personal protective equipment, people are starting to die, they're really scared. But you operate in a world of pretty much binary decisions, but your scientists don't. In their field, there are grey areas, disagreement is encouraged, especially when dealing with uncertain and evolving real-world examples. You can tell where this is going. Scientists and experts can give you information about what they think is going on, but that information is often contradictory. And in the case of COVID-19, it's about 2 weeks delayed. So deciphering it and communicating it is where the government machine comes in. And so often that hasn't been done as well as it could have been. I just think it's worth remembering here the mentality in number 10 at this point in time, because whatever you think of Boris Johnson, he'd just come off the back of winning a really impressive victory in a general election where even that team of people weren't entirely sure how well it was going to go until the last minute. So the team around Boris Johnson entered Downing Street still in campaign mode. They were bullish, they were bold, and to an extent they were arrogant, and we all know the fallout from that. But they had been proved right. It made sense for them to carry on like that, but campaign mode is short-termist, and as we all know, pandemics go on for much longer than we would like them to. And that's where expectation management comes in, I think. And I don't need to give any of you examples. We've all lived through it. I'm sure there are lots of people here today who were bitterly disappointed at Christmas. I know I was, when everything was cancelled at the last minute. But it was awful for a reason, because we thought we knew where we were at. We thought the government had managed our expectations and we knew where we stood. So when that all changed, even for an understandable reason, it shook a lot of people's faith in the messages that ministers were sending out. So I suppose the question is, how could it be done better? And there are questions for both politics and journalists here. Does the adversarial nature of our industry, for example, make it harder for politicians to hold their hands up and say, we just don't know? Or, I suppose, the Piers Morgan question, and I'm sure that Piers Morgan wouldn't mind me calling it that. What if we as journalists gave politicians the space when it was reasonable to say, we just don't know? Public are smart, they know what the most reasonable answer is. And of course, there are times when that won't be good enough. I'm sure many of you will have seen that interview on Good Morning Britain with Matt Hancock, where he wouldn't say why he didn't vote in favour of free school meals when he was there to talk about extending the free school meals policy. But what politicians will say to you off the record without their name attached is often more nuanced and more useful than what they'll say in public. And that's never been truer, actually, than now in this pandemic. And you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, at the number of ministers who will call up journalists to find out what's going on, because often it's even really hard for them to decipher what the way forward is. But using those off-the-record comments comes with its own problem, because people really hate it. They don't trust the information. COVID has highlighted this particular issue more than any other to date. And there's a danger that unnamed sources can fuel conspiracy theorists. It's not only issues like that either. Information leaks, we've all seen that happen, or it's weaponized by politicians who want a decision made now when those in government are unwilling to make it. Now, leaking it to the press is a surefire way to speed up that process, but it's also the easiest way to spook people or upset them, which can lead to loss of trust in government. And that's, of course, essential during a crisis. And Number 10 has sought its own solutions to this problem. There are regular press conferences now. You may have noticed that they have started to become even more regular in this second wave of the pandemic. There is more caution too, and I think you saw that yesterday in the schools messaging, the way the Prime Minister couched that as March the 8th being the earliest date, definitely not a set target. And that's really different from how things were in the first stage of this pandemic. There could also be daily televised briefings, although that has caused problems of its own. Maybe we'll come to that in the questions. But the point here, I suppose, is that access to information, who controls it and how it's delivered, has never been more important. And in many ways, the government just wasn't prepared for it. I think that's one of the biggest questions facing all of us, actually, as we go forward in the years ahead. But it comes from a question about how much control the government should have over our lives, because countries that have done quite well during this pandemic tend to be the ones whose governments reach much further into the lives of their citizens than ours does. Now, it was pitched really differently here, and that's pretty obvious why. The civil liberties trade-off is something the Prime Minister himself has been really wary of. Remember, this is a man finally in the hot seat. He's in Number 10 after all these years, whose political philosophy is basically to stay out of people's lives as much as is possible. And behind the scenes throughout the pandemic, Boris Johnson has held back implementing strict measures because naturally he's uncomfortable about them. He said that publicly himself, but it has caused tension within his cabinet. And at times it's made communication with the public really difficult, because you've seen this swing from measures like Eat Out to Help Out and loosening off, and then all of those restrictions back in the tiered system again. There's often been a lack of coherent direction. And now there is talk about using mobile phone GPS data, for example, to make sure people stick to quarantine rules when they enter the country. Health data can be shared with the police for the first time. That's actually a line the government refused to cross in the first stage of this pandemic. And now that's where we're at. And the new variant of COVID-19 has spooked politicians, and that's not surprising. It is concerning. But there are those inside government who feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable about this creeping erosion of our protections, and many on the Conservative backbenches too. I mean, we could talk about it in the questions again, but Desmond Swayne today is a perfect example of that. And this feeling is feeding public concerns about how long we'll all have to live under lockdown, and it's driving that narrative about how we come out of it again. A big shift has happened under this government, which they would never have condoned under any other circumstance. What will that do to public trust? And how will reliance on the state look in coming months? You can see this debate really clearly in the deliberations over extending universal credit and that £20 a week payment. It's currently sat on a number of different desks in Whitehall waiting for someone to grasp it. But COVID-19 has exposed more obviously than ever before the deep divide between rich and poor in this country. Now, the Prime Minister fought an election promising to level up, and I don't think even he could have known at that point how relevant that message would be. But will the pandemic make it easier or actually harder for him to deliver on it? How can he, for example, stick to his promise while removing the support that's propping up many in those communities right now? Because he ultimately will have to. The political implications of those budget decisions are already keeping the Chancellor up at night, and it's only going to get harder. That divide is seen most starkly in statistics which show that those from poorer backgrounds are far more likely to die of this disease, often because of the jobs that they do. But it runs deeper than that too. Most of you will remember those headlines warning second homeowners not to leave London and spread COVID to the countryside. And that particular row really came to a head for Boris Johnson when Dominic Cummings took his trip to Barnard Castle. Now, it's funny, you guys obviously work in this industry, you know what I mean when I talk about cut through. And some things do and some things don't in politics, but my God, that one did. I remember driving behind a car at the height of the pandemic, and there was this A3 homemade poster of Dominic Cummings in the back window, and it just said, "Don't worry, this journey is legal, I'm testing my eyesight." Now, it might seem funny, but actually the government became a joke overnight, and the Prime Minister's judgment was really called into question by that event. The fury among his own cabinet and about that row was something I've never seen before. And remember, many of them had felt the sharp tongue of Dominic Cummings themselves. They finally felt able to criticise him, knowing that he was weakened. And it probably was the lowest moment in the pandemic in terms of how the government was working, because it just wasn't. But that divide, now so painfully exposed, is an opportunity for the government too. With the economy so battered, could this be the perfect time to reinvest in those communities who've been cast aside for years? With working from home more possible, for example, and cities less important, will the Chancellor seek to cement this, driving a renewal in towns around the country as people move away from city hubs? These are all choices the government can make in the months to come. But as always, there are other issues on the Prime Minister's mind too. Strip COVID out of this for a moment, and this year we'd likely have been talking about what Brexit means for Britain and how to move forward. Just imagine, without COVID, this whole talk could have been about Brexit. You've dodged a bullet there. But it is something that Boris Johnson cares deeply about. If you like, it is his legacy, and it will continue to preoccupy him in the years to come. We're starting to see an early boost for his cause in the way the UK has managed the vaccine rollout. By all accounts, a success, despite some issues with supply, especially when compared to the way the European Union has tackled the same problem. But there is a much bigger stage here. Boris Johnson hopes to strike a trade deal really quickly with the US. Whether Joe Biden is willing to do that is another question. But the G7 summit and COP26 are both prime opportunities for the government to assert itself in issues on the world stage, and they're an essential part of the Prime Minister's plan to reintroduce Britain as an independent nation and convince others that we are worth doing business with. Now, there are still questions about how easy that message is going to be to sell, given how many states have raced to secure vaccinations for themselves before belatedly thinking about the countries who may struggle. Is the argument for globalisation actually less convincing in the wake of this disease? That's something the government will have to tackle. Which leads me neatly to the big domestic political question facing Boris Johnson, and it's the final one I will pose to you today before I start answering yours. So do send them all in, please. And it's nationalism. Now, it's something that's been fueled by the pandemic in a way that I think nobody would have predicted, because in Scotland, the government is in control of health. And in the eyes of many, Nicola Sturgeon has done a really good job. It makes her argument easier that an independent Scotland would be better off without Westminster. You can tell Boris Johnson is really worried about that. He's in Scotland today to hammer home the message that the union is stronger in tackling the pandemic when it's together, but it feels increasingly difficult to deny Scotland another referendum. And don't underestimate the impact that losing Scotland would have on the Prime Minister. So I think that's going to be something that really does play large in Boris Johnson's government over the next couple of years. And as yet, it's still an unanswered question. So in the end, this is about what kind of country we ultimately want to be and how we want the world to see us. Who answers those questions and how we answer them is going to shape us all for decades to come. Thank you very much. Now, I would love to answer some of your questions. So if you would like to keep sending them over. Oh, look, we've got a whole list. This is great. So EH, I'm going to take yours first. Do you believe that the Cummings affair affected the way the public responded to the following lockdown restrictions, including the one we're in now, and how they abided by the rules? Advice. This is a really interesting question because the actual data on how well people stick to COVID regulations shows that most people do. They really try quite hard. Even the data, for example, on traffic and how many people are going to work. Yes, more people are going in this second lockdown, but actually more people are allowed to than were the first time round. So you've got to think of it in those terms too. I think compliance isn't always the issue here, but it's definitely about trust and about tone. I think in the first stage of the pandemic, there was a lot of evidence, polling evidence, to suggest that the feeling towards Boris Johnson and his government was supportive, that people were actually quite behind some of the actions, even though they were really tough, that were being taken. But I think that has waned in this stage of the pandemic. And part of that is due to Dominic Cummings. It did shake trust, but also part of that is about the way that messages have been communicated to us all and the way that things change at the last minute. And that's partly why when I said that I think there is a question for journalism here about how we approach issues like a pandemic. Because if you don't know, which is where the Prime Minister is now at with schools, and he was quite clear about that last night in the press conference, I thought that was quite stark, then the best thing to do is just to be honest with people, because people can see and they understand what's going on. If you're not honest and you try and give them false promises, like in the first stage when the Prime Minister said, you know, we can tie this up by Christmas if we really try, people lose that faith. And once they've lost faith, they might still comply, but they might feel really grudging about doing it. So, you know, I think the figures show that people are sticking to the rules, but it's becoming much harder for them to do that. Jake says, why can't government ministers show fallibility and tell the truth? We all fail. A standard set of never getting things wrong means lack of trust is hardwired into the relationship between politics and people. Why do they continue to do it? Well, again, I suppose it goes back to that answer I just gave. It's part of the way the system is set up. It's quite adversarial. There's an anecdote that I was going to include in what I was talking to you there about the reputation of the British press abroad with other groups of press journalists. And there was a really funny story about Francois Hollande, the former French president, came over to the UK to meet with David Cameron, and there were a group of British press and French press all at Brize Norton ready to ask questions. And the elephant in the room was, at the time, Francois Hollande was actually having an affair, and it was all over the papers and it was kind of undermining him, but not one of the French journalists asked about it. And it took a British journalist to do that. And the French journalists were really shocked that we had broached that subject, because they just felt it was kind of out of bounds and it was inappropriate. And I think that just shows you that actually the British press are really happy to ask those difficult questions, but sometimes it can set up that us versus them, and it can perpetuate this feeling among politicians that it's actually better to say nothing, when we all know that even if things change, if people explain to us honestly, that's often the best way forward. There are, of course, times when politicians need to do better too. It's not just journalists who need to think about this question, but I think it's a broader conversation we should have. Tessa Gooding says, what is your view on the role of the media news in managing the public's mental health during the pandemic? It's an interesting question. I wonder, Tessa, if you come at this from the perspective that a lot of people do, that actually the press has not helped in this way, that we've contributed to it. Personally, for me, I think that the best thing to do is to give people as much information as you can provide in as clear a manner as you possibly can. And I think it's up to the public to decide how much of that they consume and how they consume it. I think our job as the press is not to decide what we should tell you, it's to give you the most accurate information that we can. But it does come with trade-offs. I mean, I work in an industry where every single day we are bombarded with death figures and awful pictures inside hospitals, and you know, people in the pandemic. My mum works in care homes. In the pandemic, in the first stage, that was really difficult to be working in the politics side of it, knowing the impact on my own family. It's very, very difficult, the mental health aspect. And I do think, again, when we're talking about questions that are going to face governments in the years to come, the mental health impact here is going to be a huge one, not just on all of us adults, but on children too, particularly about education. So I'm afraid I don't have a better answer for you than that, but it's certainly something that the government is going to need to focus a lot of time and money on trying to sort out. David Black says, do daily televised briefings and press conferences undermine the role of Parliament in holding government to account? That's interesting. I've never thought of that before. Undermine Parliament? I don't think so, no. I mean, Parliament under the current Speaker has lots of opportunities to put questions to ministers. There's obviously urgent questions, there's Prime Minister's questions, and it's done a really good job actually in the pandemic with virtual sittings to make sure that people can still contribute. And I think it's really important that that continues to happen. The idea of the daily briefings, without getting too niche about it, is that Downing Street wanted to set them up on camera. It's actually just a version of the lobby briefings, which happen every day anyway. And lobby journalists are all national and local journalists who work in Parliament and write about politics or broadcast about politics. Every morning we have one of those conversations with the Prime Minister's spokesman where we get to ask them questions and they get to give us information, mostly on the record, but sometimes off the record too. Number 10 wants to televise them. Now, there are those in government who say it would be a really good opportunity for everybody to see how that works behind the scenes. There are some people in the media who worry that it's a way of trying to diminish the role of journalists because they believe that the public won't like the way that questions are asked repeatedly and all that kind of stuff. I don't think it undermines anything. I think it adds to it. I think any opportunity to question politicians adds to it, but they've got to be the right kind of questions. And I won't repeat what I said earlier, but I think that's something that we all need to have a think about why we're asking something and what we're trying to get out of it. And mostly, for the most part, actually, those questions now at the press briefings are very much focused on that. I think in the beginning, it was a slightly different story. Rob Newman, it's absolutely right that trust in government has taken a knock, but trust in the media and indeed in advertising is also at record lows. What do you think are the collective steps we can take to address this problem? It's a really, really good question, Rob. I can't answer for your industry. I wish that we were all in the same room so that somebody could tell me. I'd love to have that conversation. For the press, I think it's about thinking about why we're doing the job and thinking about who we're trying to do the job for. So my opinion as a journalist is that, most people, when you read a newspaper, you often don't read a byline. It's not about who the journalist is, it's about what the questions that we ask and about how we get that information to people. And I think we need to go back to basics a bit on that. And we need to think about, are we trying to set a politician up? Are we trying to ask a question we know that they can't answer? Or are we trying to get them to give us information that people desperately need? And as I say, most of the industry does do that and does it really well. But there's been a big question about how specialisms have been diminished. So at the start of the pandemic, obviously journalism has gone through a really difficult period financially. We don't have a huge base of science journalists. We don't have a huge base of statisticians. And I will hold my hands up and say, my experience of science ended when I did A-level chemistry. I'm not a scientist, but a lot of the data that we're trying to decipher and communicate is very complicated. And I think understanding how science works is really important. So that's something that we should do more. We should invest in our specialisms and we should give people the opportunity to kind of see how it works. And it goes back to what I said about unnamed sources. That's not made up. That's not somebody who doesn't exist. It is a way of giving information when people don't feel able to give it. But again, it changes that question about trust. It's a really, really difficult question to answer. Jason Cotterill says, Piers Morgan is being heralded as more effective at holding the government to account than the opposition. How do the opposition change their approach to be more effective? Really difficult question facing Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. And I do think if we weren't in this pandemic, we would be seeing a lot more criticism of him. He's fantastically good at forensic questions, and in Prime Minister's questions, he's very good at getting to the detail in a way that Boris Johnson isn't naturally, actually. It's not his natural stage. That's not how he is as a politician. But has he reinvigorated the Labour Party? Have all those people who left the party felt that they can come back? I'm not sure that they do yet. So there is a big question there. I think the role of the opposition in this pandemic has again been something that's quite difficult to decipher. Do you really go hard on the government and criticise them for decisions that are pretty much impossible? Or do you try and collaborate them? And I think Sir Keir Starmer has actually managed to walk a reasonably good path through the two of those. But as we move out of this pandemic and we come to look at those bigger questions, that will be the time when people really want to see Labour step up. And the question is whether he is going to do that. We've got about a minute left. Let's try and get two more. Bramwell Johnson of Propeller Group says, hello, I've seen research saying people trust businesses and CEOs more than governments recently. What does the government need to do to rebuild trust with the public? Off the top of my head, really quickly, honesty. And I think it's part of that conversation again. And we're starting to see it. We saw it at the press conference yesterday. Boris Johnson saying March the 8th is the earliest date for schools to go back. I know you'll hate me for it. I know it's difficult, but I can't promise you anything more than that. Communicating the evidence base for that. I think there was some real criticism of Matt Hancock, the health secretary, at a previous press conference when he talked about how much more virulent the Kent strain of COVID-19 is, but didn't provide any evidence. That actually caused quite a big problem for the government. So evidence and trust and being honest. Let's see if we can get one more in. Jordan, do you think the press has upheld its responsibility to hold government to account throughout the pandemic? has the mainstream press generally looked too kindly upon Number 10's failures? I would say no, Jordan. I would say we haven't looked too kindly upon it, and I think there is going to be a time and a place for that conversation about where things went wrong and where things could have been done better. And I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been a delight to be with you. I hope you enjoyed that.